The creepy neighbor. It started a week before Thanksgiving. I just moved into the neighborhood a few months earlier, and most of my neighbors had been friendly, stopping by to introduce themselves or waving from their lawns. All except Mr. Barlow. He lived across the street, an older man with a hunched posture and thinning white hair. He never spoke, never waved, and never seemed to leave his house. At first, I chalked it up to him being a private person, but then I noticed the staring. Every time I came home from work, there he was, standing at his living room window, his pale face framed by the curtain. He didn't move, didn't nod, just stared. At first, it was unsettling but harmless. I tried to ignore it, telling myself he was just a lonely old man. But then it started to escalate. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I found something on my porch, a small, dead bird. Its neck was twisted at an odd angle, and its tiny black eyes were wide open. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I looked across the street, and there he was, standing in his window. This time, he wasn't just staring, he was smiling. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe the bird had hit a window and fallen, and his smile was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The week of Thanksgiving, things got worse. On Monday, I came home to find my trash cans overturned. Garbage was strewn across the yard, but nothing seemed to be missing. I spent the next hour cleaning it up, fuming, but I didn't think to look up until I was almost done. Mr. Barlow was outside, standing at the edge of his yard. He wasn't smiling this time. He was just staring, his face blank. "Do you need something?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and shuffled back into his house without a word. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about that dead bird, the overturned trash, and the way Mr. Barlow just stood there, watching. On Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, my husband, Jake, left early for a business trip. He hated being away for the holiday, but the trip had been scheduled for months. "It's just 2 days," he said as he kissed me goodbye. "I'll be back in time for Thanksgiving dinner." I tried to hide my unease. Alone in the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That evening, I was in the kitchen prepping food for the next day when I saw movement outside. I glanced out the window and saw Mr. Barlow, standing at the edge of our backyard. He was closer this time, his figure illuminated by the glow of the kitchen lights. My heart raced. I locked the door and grabbed my phone, debating whether to call the police. But what would I say? My neighbor is standing in my yard. That didn't seem like much of an emergency. Instead, I turned off the lights, hoping he wouldn't realize I'd seen him. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a noise, something tapping against the window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, tap, tap, tap. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. My stomach dropped. Mr. Barlow was standing on my porch. He was close enough that I could see the lines on his face, the glint of his eyes as he peered inside. He raised his hand and tapped on the glass again. "Go away!" I yelled, my voice trembling. He didn't move. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I spoke to the operator, I watched him. He didn't run, didn't hide. He just stood there, staring at me through the glass. When the police arrived, Mr. Barlow was gone. They searched the yard but found nothing except for a single muddy footprint on the porch. I told them about the dead bird, the trash, the staring. They listened politely but didn't seem concerned. "He's probably harmless," one of the officers said. "Just a lonely old man." I wasn't convinced. Thanksgiving morning, I was exhausted. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow. I tried to focus on cooking, but my nerves were shot. Around noon, Jake called to say his flight was delayed. "I'm sorry, babe," he said. "I'll be home as soon as I can." I tried to hide my disappointment. "It's fine. Just hurry." After hanging up, I returned to the kitchen, trying to distract myself. But then I noticed it, the back door slightly ajar. I froze. I knew I'd locked it the night before. Grabbing a knife from the counter, I crept toward the door. My hands were shaking as I pushed it open, stepping onto the porch. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I stepped back inside and locked the door, my heart pounding. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe I'd forgotten to lock it after all. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I heard footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak. I muted the TV and listened. There it was again, another creak, closer this time. Jake wasn't home yet, and I knew I was alone. Clutching the knife, I crept upstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the bedroom at the end. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. I reached the bedroom and pushed the door open. Nothing. The room was empty. But then I saw it, the closet door slightly open. I held my breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. In one quick motion, I flung it open. The closet was empty, but something was off. The smell hit me first, a sour, musty odor that made my stomach churn. Then I noticed the back wall. There was a small door, barely visible in the dim light. I'd never noticed it before. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling. It creaked open to reveal a narrow crawl space. Inside, I found a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and something that made my blood run cold, a Polaroid photo of me, taken through the kitchen window. By the time Jake got home, I was a mess. I showed him the photo, the crawl space, the footprints. He wanted to confront Mr. Barlow, but I begged him not to. "Just let the police handle it," I said. But the next morning, when the police went to question him, they found his house empty. The windows were boarded up, the furniture covered in dust. It looked like no one had lived there for years. To this day, I don't know where he went, or how long he'd been watching me. The house in the woods. Every year, our family gathers for Thanksgiving at my grandparents' house, a charming but isolated place deep in the woods. As a kid, I loved going there, the smell of the pine trees, the crackling fire in the living room, and Grandma's incredible cooking made it magical. But this year was different. My grandparents had passed away earlier that year, and the house had been empty for months. Still, my parents insisted on keeping up the tradition. They said it would help us feel connected to Grandma and Grandpa. I wasn't so sure, but I went along with it. We arrived late Wednesday afternoon. The house was exactly as I remembered it, though it felt emptier somehow, as if the warmth and love that had once filled it were gone. As the sun set and the woods grew dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. After dinner, my dad and uncle started a fire in the living room while the rest of us unpacked and settled in. I went upstairs to my old bedroom to put my bag away. As I entered the room, I felt a chill. The window was slightly open, letting in the cold November air. That was odd. I was sure we'd closed all the windows when we arrived. I shut it quickly and pulled the curtains closed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled, and the old house creaked and groaned in response. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hall. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. My heart raced as I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The next morning, I told my mom about the noises, but she brushed it off. "It's an old house," she said. "It makes noises." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. While the adults cooked and set the table, I decided to explore the woods. It was a tradition of mine. I'd always loved wandering through the trees, collecting pine cones, and enjoying the crisp autumn air. But this time, the woods felt different. The trees seemed darker, their branches twisted and gnarled. The air was still, too still, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the snapping of twigs. At one point, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. When I returned to the house, I noticed something strange. The window in the living room was wide open, and a cold breeze was blowing through. "Who opened the window?" I asked. Everyone looked at me blankly. "No one's been near the windows," my dad said. We all exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, the atmosphere was tense. The food was delicious, but I couldn't enjoy it. Every now and then, I'd catch someone glancing toward the windows or the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms. Halfway through the meal, the lights flickered. "Probably the wind," my uncle said, though his voice wavered. But then they flickered again, and this time, they stayed off. We all sat in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering fire in the living room. "I'll check the breaker," my dad said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll come with you," my uncle added. The rest of us stayed at the table, huddled together in the dim light. The minutes dragged on, and the house grew colder. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, soft, faint, like the wind carrying voices through the room. "Did you hear that?" I asked. My mom shook her head, but my cousin nodded. "It's coming from the hall," she whispered. We all turned to look, but the hallway was dark and empty. When my dad and uncle returned, they looked shaken. "The breaker's fine," my dad said. "There's no reason for the power to be out." We decided to call it a night. Everyone grabbed flashlights and headed to their rooms. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. And then I heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway. I held my breath, my heart pounding. Suddenly, my door creaked open. I froze, staring into the darkness. "Hello?" I whispered. No answer. The next morning, I woke up to find the power back on and the house eerily quiet. As we gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, everyone looked tired and on edge. "We're leaving today," my dad said abruptly. No one argued. As we packed up and loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. And that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching us leave. The house was sold a few months later. I never told anyone about what I saw, but I can't help wondering if the new owners have experienced the same thing, or worse. The haunted road trip. Thanksgiving was supposed to be simple this year. My girlfriend, Kelly, and I decided to skip the chaos of extended family and take a road trip to a cozy cabin we'd rented a few hours away. We were looking forward to a quiet, romantic holiday, just the two of us, away from the stress of our daily lives. We packed the car with everything we needed: groceries for a Thanksgiving feast, blankets, games, and a stack of movies. The drive was supposed to be a fun part of the adventure, a chance to enjoy the scenic countryside. But almost from the moment we left, things started to feel off. It began on the highway. We'd been driving for about an hour when Kelly pointed out a car behind us. It was an old sedan, rusty and beat up, with one headlight dimmer than the other. "That car's been following us for a while," she said, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. I checked the mirror myself. She was right. The car was hanging back, keeping just enough distance to seem casual. But it didn't change lanes or pass us, even when the road was clear. "Probably just coincidence," I said, though I didn't believe it. We pulled off the highway to stop at a gas station, hoping the car would keep going. But as I filled the tank, I noticed it parked at the far end of the lot. The driver stayed inside, the windows too tinted to see who it was. "Let's go," Kelly said, her voice tight. I didn't argue. Back on the road, the car disappeared for a while. I started to relax, thinking we'd been overreacting. But then, as we turned onto a smaller country road, it reappeared. "How is it still behind us?" Kelly asked, her voice rising. I didn't have an answer. The road grew darker as the sun set. Trees loomed on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the last traces of daylight. The car stayed behind us, its dim headlights casting long shadows on the road ahead. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, gripping the wheel. "I'm pulling over." "No," Kelly said quickly. "What if they stop too?" The thought made my stomach churn. We pressed on, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, after what felt like hours, the car turned down a side road and disappeared. "Thank God," Kelly said, slumping back in her seat. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the unease in my chest. We reached the cabin just after 8 p.m. It was exactly as advertised, cozy and secluded, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the woods. As we unpacked the car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the old sedan to come rolling up the driveway. But the night was quiet, and I told myself we were safe. After dinner, we settled in to watch a movie. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for the first time all day, I started to relax. But then, just as the movie reached its climax, we heard it, a knock at the door. Kelly and I froze. "Who could that be?" she whispered. We hadn't seen another house for miles, and the idea of a stranger showing up unannounced sent a chill down my spine. "I'll check," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the surrounding woods silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. "Maybe it was an animal," Kelly said when I came back inside. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. The knocking came again an hour later, louder this time. I flung the door open, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was messing with us. But once again, there was no one there. Instead, lying on the porch was a single object, a small, rusted key. "What the hell?" Kelly whispered, staring at it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was old and heavy, with no markings to indicate what it might belong to. "I'm locking the doors," I said, tossing the key onto the coffee table. We tried to sleep, but the cabin creaked and groaned in the wind, and every sound set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, shaking Kelly awake. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Grabbing the flashlight, I crept to the window and peered out. In the moonlight, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. As I watched, it stepped closer, and I realized it was holding something, a long, rusted key, identical to the one we'd found on the porch. "Get the car keys," I said, my voice shaking. Kelly didn't argue. We grabbed our bags and bolted for the door, not bothering to pack everything. As we sped down the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the middle of the road, watching us leave. We didn't stop driving until we reached a motel an hour away. The next morning, I called the cabin's owner to report what had happened. "That's strange," he said. "You're the only ones who rented it this week." I asked if there was a spare key to the cabin, but he insisted there wasn't. When I mentioned the rusted key we'd found, he went quiet. Finally, he said, "That sounds like the old master key. It went missing years ago, after an incident." "What incident?" I asked, but he refused to elaborate. We never found out who, or what, was outside the cabin that night. But to this day, I can't drive down a dark, wooded road without feeling like I'm being followed. The grocery store stalker. The day before Thanksgiving is chaos at every grocery store, and I should have known better than to wait until then to shop. But work had been hectic all week, and I'd barely had time to make a shopping list. So there I was, in a packed parking lot, hunting for a spot and mentally preparing myself for the madness inside. It was already dark, and the parking lot was poorly lit. As I circled the lot for the third time, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He wasn't carrying bags or wearing the bright green vest of the employees gathering carts. He just stood there, his hands shoved into the pockets of a long black coat, watching the cars. Watching me. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. He was probably waiting for someone. After all, it was Thanksgiving Eve, families and friends gathering, people coming and going. It wasn't that unusual. Finally, I found a spot near the back of the lot and grabbed my bags. As I walked toward the store, I glanced toward the entrance. The man was gone. Inside, the chaos was in full swing. Shoppers pushed overloaded carts through narrow aisles, and kids whined about wanting snacks. I weaved through the crowd, grabbing items as quickly as I could. As I reached for a box of stuffing mix, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. It wasn't the casual glance of another shopper looking for the same item. This was different. I turned my head slightly, trying to be subtle, and there he was. The man from the parking lot. He stood at the end of the aisle, not pretending to shop or browse. Just standing there, staring straight at me. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he just happened to be on the same aisle. I moved on, pushing my cart toward the produce section. The feeling didn't go away. When I turned to grab a bag of potatoes, I saw him again. This time, he was closer, pretending to examine a display of apples. I felt my pulse quicken. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he wasn't following me. But then it happened again. And again. No matter where I went, the dairy aisle, the bakery, even the frozen foods, he was there, always a few steps behind. When I got to the checkout lanes, I was almost relieved to see how long the lines were. At least I'd be surrounded by people. I chose a line near the middle of the store and kept glancing over my shoulder. I didn't see him, and for a moment, I thought I'd been imagining it all. But as the cashier scanned my items, I looked up and saw him again. He was standing near the customer service desk, partially hidden behind a display of gift cards. His pale eyes locked onto mine, and that eerie, tight-lipped smile spread across his face. "Ma'am? Your total," the cashier said, snapping me out of it. I hurriedly paid and bagged my groceries, my hands trembling. I wanted to tell someone, but what would I say? A man was looking at me? The store was packed. He hadn't done anything. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Pushing my cart into the parking lot, I scanned the area, hoping he was gone. The lot was even darker now, the overhead lights casting long, eerie shadows. I walked quickly, my cart rattling over the asphalt. When I reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I didn't see him, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I threw the bags into the trunk, slammed it shut, and jumped into the driver's seat. As I locked the doors, I let out a shaky breath, relieved to be inside. But then I saw him. He was standing 2 rows over, leaning against the car, his face half hidden in the shadows. My hands shook as I started the engine. I backed out of the spot as quickly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was walking toward the exit, his pace calm and deliberate, as if he knew exactly where I was going. The drive home was a blur. I took turns I didn't need to, doubling back and weaving through side streets, trying to lose him. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, scanning the street. It was empty. No sign of him. I grabbed my bags and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night I couldn't relax. Every creak of the house set me on edge. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see his face. Around midnight I decided to make some tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I waited for the water to boil, I glanced out the kitchen window. The backyard was dark, but something caught my eye, a shadow moving near the edge of the fence. I froze, staring into the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw it, a figure, stepping out of the shadows. It was him. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. He was just standing there, watching the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, barely able to get the words out. "There's a man in my backyard," I whispered. The operator assured me officers were on their way. I stayed on the line, crouched behind the kitchen counter, peeking over the edge. The man hadn't moved. When the police arrived, their flashlights swept through the yard, but he was gone. They found footprints in the dirt outside the window. The prints led to the fence, where they abruptly stopped, as if he'd vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. The next day, I tried to shake it off. It was Thanksgiving, after all, and I had family coming over. I didn't want to ruin the holiday with my paranoia. But as I prepped the turkey and set the table, I couldn't stop glancing at the windows. When my family arrived, I felt a wave of relief. The house was full of laughter and noise, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. But that feeling didn't last. Later that evening, as we were sitting down to dinner, the doorbell rang. I froze. "Are you expecting someone?" my sister asked. I shook my head. My brother-in-law stood to answer the door, but I stopped him. "Wait," I said, my voice trembling. "Let me check first." I peeked through the peephole, and my blood ran cold. It was him. He was standing on the porch, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, that same eerie smile on his face. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. "What is it?" my sister asked. "It's him," I whispered. "The man from the store." My brother-in-law didn't hesitate. He yanked open the door and stepped outside. "What do you want?" he demanded. The man didn't answer. He just smiled, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The police were called again, but they didn't find him. That night I couldn't sleep. Every shadow, every noise set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m. I heard it, a soft scraping sound, coming from the back door. I crept downstairs, my hands trembling, and peeked out the window. He was there, crouched by the door, trying to pick the lock. I grabbed a knife and yelled, "I'm calling the police!" He looked up, his face twisted into a snarl, and ran into the night. The police never caught him. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he followed me. But every Thanksgiving, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting. The mysterious Thanksgiving guest. Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday, but this year was different. My parents had invited a guest, a man I'd never met before named Mr. Elwood. "It's just a small favor," Mom said when I asked about him. "He's a friend of your Uncle Roger's. He didn't have anywhere else to go." I didn't mind having guests, but something about the way my mom avoided my gaze made me uneasy. Still, I didn't press her. The first sign that something was off came when Mr. Elwood arrived. He showed up early, well before any of the other guests. His car, an old, rusted station wagon, wheezed as he pulled into the driveway. When he stepped out, I couldn't help but stare. He was tall and thin, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His hair was wiry and unkempt, and his eyes, they were a pale, watery blue that seemed to pierce right through me. "You must be Sophie," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Your mother told me so much about you." He didn't shake my hand, just smiled with a mouthful of yellow teeth and walked past me into the house. For the next hour, it was just the two of us. My mom had gone to pick up some last-minute groceries, and the rest of the family wouldn't arrive until later. I tried to make small talk, but Mr. Elwood barely responded. He just sat at the kitchen table, watching me as I prepped the food. "Do you live nearby?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "No," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "I'm just passing through." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. When my mom got back, I pulled her aside. "Who is this guy?" I whispered. "Just be polite," she said quickly, her eyes darting toward the kitchen. "He's complicated." Her answer didn't make me feel better. As more family members arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Everyone was cheerful and busy, setting the table, watching football, or helping in the kitchen. But Mr. Elwood's presence cast a shadow over everything. He didn't mingle or join in any conversations. Instead, he sat in the corner of the living room, sipping a glass of water and watching everyone with those piercing eyes. By the time dinner was served, the tension was palpable. We all sat around the table, passing dishes and sharing stories. But every time someone tried to include Mr. Elwood, he responded with curt, one-word answers. Then, halfway through the meal, he said something that made the room go silent. "You're all such a lovely family," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's a shame about what happened here." My dad frowned. "What do you mean?" "You know," Elwood said, his smile widening. "The fire." "The fire?" My parents looked at each other, their faces pale. "How do you know about that?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. Elwood leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with amusement. "It's a small town," he said. "People talk." After dinner, my mom pulled me aside again. "I need you to take him to the guest room," she said. "What? Why can't he stay somewhere else?" Mom grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Just do it," she hissed. I didn't argue. As I led Mr. Elwood upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. "This is your room," I said, opening the door to the small guest room. He stepped inside but didn't close the door. Instead, he turned to me and smiled. "Thank you," he said. "You've been very kind." I nodded quickly and turned to leave, but before I could, he spoke again. "By the way," he said, his voice low, "it wasn't just a fire. It was something worse." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, footsteps in the hall, whispers just outside my door. Around 3 a.m., I decided to check on Mr. Elwood. When I opened the door to the guest room, it was empty. The bed was untouched, and the window was wide open. On the nightstand was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. My hands trembled as I opened it. The message was simple. "Thank you for letting me in." The next morning, my mom refused to talk about Mr. Elwood. When I tried to bring it up, she cut me off. "He's gone," she said sharply. "Let it go." But I couldn't. Not after what I found in the attic later that day, an old newspaper clipping about a fire that had killed a family in this very house. Our house, over 30 years ago. The photo accompanying the article sent chills down my spine. There, in the background, was a man standing among the ashes. It was Mr. Elwood. The strange break-in. Thanksgiving at my sister's house is always a warm, chaotic affair. Her home, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, usually feels safe and inviting. But this year, something happened that I still can't explain. I arrived Wednesday night after a long drive. My sister, Rachel, greeted me at the door with a hug, her 2 young kids buzzing around excitedly. The house smelled amazing: spices, roasting vegetables, and the unmistakable aroma of fresh pie. "Glad you're here," Rachel said. "You're in the guest room upstairs. Dinner's in an hour." I carried my bags up and settled in. The room was cozy, with a view of the backyard. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost too quiet compared to the bustling city I'd come from. I didn't know it then, but that silence was a warning. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind or one of the kids moving around downstairs. But then I heard it again, a faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming on glass. I sat up, my pulse quickening. It was coming from the window. I hesitated, then pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just the backyard, bathed in moonlight. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just a branch or an animal. Still, I locked the window before crawling back into bed. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to Rachel. "Probably raccoons," she said, flipping pancakes for the kids. "They've been nosy lately." Her husband, Tom, chimed in. "I'll check the yard later. Maybe we need to trim the trees back." Their calmness reassured me, and I spent the day helping with Thanksgiving prep, playing with the kids, and catching up with family. By the time dinner rolled around, the strange noise was forgotten, until it happened again. This time, it was louder. We were all in the dining room, laughing and passing dishes around, when we heard a series of sharp knocks. It sounded like it was coming from the front door. "I'll get it," Tom said, standing up. But when he opened the door, there was no one there. "Probably kids messing around," he said with a shrug. He closed the door, locked it, and returned to the table. But the knocks came again, this time from the back door. We all froze. Rachel gave Tom a worried look. He grabbed a flashlight and headed for the kitchen. "Stay here," he said over his shoulder. The rest of us sat in silence, straining to hear. After a few minutes, Tom returned, looking puzzled. "There's no one out there," he said. "But I found this." He held up a scrap of paper. It was folded in half and damp from the dew. Rachel opened it, her face paling as she read the single word scrawled across it. "Hello?" Rachel tried to laugh it off, but I could tell she was rattled. "Probably a prank," she said, though her voice shook. We tried to go back to dinner, but the mood had shifted. The kids seemed oblivious, but the adults exchanged uneasy glances. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle, when I heard it again, the tapping at the window. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and crept to the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled back the curtain and froze. A face stared back at me. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The figure was pressed against the glass, its breath fogging up the pane. I stumbled back, fumbling for my phone. When I looked again, the face was gone. I rushed downstairs to wake Tom and Rachel. "There's someone outside," I said, my voice shaking. Tom grabbed a baseball bat and went to check, while Rachel called the police. The officers arrived quickly and searched the property, but they didn't find anyone. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of them said. "But let us know if you see anything else." They left, and we tried to go back to sleep, though none of us felt safe. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was the sound of a door creaking open. I froze, listening. The sound was coming from downstairs. Grabbing my phone, I crept out of bed and peeked down the stairs. The front door was wide open. "Tom! Rachel!" I hissed, rushing to wake them. They bolted upright as I explained what I'd seen. Tom grabbed his bat again and headed for the door. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped. "What is it?" Rachel called. Tom didn't answer. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. In the middle of the living room was a pile of dirt and leaves, as if someone had tracked them in from the woods. On top of the pile was another scrap of paper. This one read, "You let me in." We spent the rest of the night locked in one room, too afraid to sleep. By morning, we decided to leave. Tom and Rachel agreed to stay with his parents until they could install better locks and cameras. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the house. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows, a shadowy figure watching us leave. I didn't tell Rachel. She didn't need to know. To this day, we still don't know who or what was out there that Thanksgiving night. But I haven't been back to their house since. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. I will be posting at least 4 times a week. So if you like these, there will be more stories to help fuel your nightmares.